Hey guys, well, I've had a number of requests for me to do reaction videos to historical content on YouTube. So I thought I'd dive into that today, and I'm looking at alternate history hubs. What if the South won the American Civil War? So we're going to watch, and I'll kind of offer some commentary as I go about this. And I want to say, first of all, that when it gets into the topic of what ifs and alternate history, there's really no right or wrong. So any criticism or any differing opinion I might offer is just that. It's my opinion. It's how I see things. Alternate History Hub sees things their way. Other people see things another way. I would love to hear how you see things and how your reactions would be to what I say or to what is said on this video. Use the comment section below. And if you want to see more of this kind of thing, hit that like button and make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another video. We'll probably be doing more of this. So let's dive in.
The Civil War was the most devastating conflict in America's history. Roughly 640,000 Americans died in the 4-year fighting between the Union and Confederates, which eventually resulted in a Southern defeat, keeping the United States, well, united. But what if in an alternate timeline, the South won the Civil War?
All right.
What, many ask, what would even be the outcome had the Confederates win? What would be the possible scenarios of a Southern victory? Well, dear viewer, stop interrupting me, it's quite rude. That is what this video is about. By looking at facts and historical events, we can get a few rough ideas about what this Confederate independence might look like. What if the South won the Civil War? I'm not here to make an argument about whether the South could have won the war. The Union definitely had a significant advantage, with a higher population, more industry, and larger army. But in this alternate timeline, things go right for the South.
So let's talk for a second before he gets into his factors into what would make a Southern victory. I see a lot of parallels between the American Civil War and the American Revolutionary War. Now, if you were to ask a Southerner, they would have said the same thing because many of them called it their second war of independence. And I think the factors that would have gone into a Confederate victory would have been pretty much the same. The American Army in the Patriot Army in the Revolutionary War was never going to defeat the British Army in head-to-head battle. It just wasn't the way they could do things, and George Washington understood that. The way that the revolution was won was two things. It was alliances, especially with France, but also with places like Spain, and then financial resources from the Netherlands, for example. And number two, it was just outlasting the British until the public got sick of it, until they got tired of paying for it. I think the South, in order to have won, needed to do the same thing. They needed help from Europe, and they needed to outlast the Northern public to where they turned against the war. But that never actually happened. So let's see what he says here.
The future in this Confederate victory would depend on two factors: the peace negotiations with the Union and the size of the conflict.
Okay.
Being smaller and less developed, the South would only have a successful existence if the Union simply gave up on their war.
I agree with that.
There were people in the North who would have went into a treaty with the Independent CSA.
Yes.
George McClellan, a Union general turned presidential candidate, even spoke of going to peace talks with the South.
Now, I will say this. The 1864 election, where McClellan was the Democratic nominee, McClellan ran as a war candidate, even though the Democratic platform was for peace, was for a negotiated settlement with the South. McClellan personally said he wanted to try and win the war. So I don't know if it's just quite as simple as to say that McClellan was open to peace negotiations. He may have been, but I don't know that that's really who he was, even though that's what his party was for.
So it wouldn't be too crazy if this did happen. In this alternate timeline, it does, effectively letting the South win the war. If the South won early into the conflict, relations wouldn't be too damaged with their former Americans.
That makes sense.
Each nation would control themselves and trade with one another. Just as in our timeline, Northern textiles use Southern cotton to create products which make the South wealthy.
I could
This
see that.
economic relationship could easily continue if both were separate nations, at least for a little while. One thing we need to discuss in an independent CSA is just how long slavery would have actually
20 years.
lasted.
I give it 20 years.
Slavery was an essential part to Southern economics and social hierarchy. It was the main reason the South seceded from the Union in the first place. The Southern aristocrats feared the election of Lincoln would take away their main economic power. Of course they would secede to save their fortune. Slavery was even protected by the CSA Constitution because of this fact.
Now, I don't know what he's going to say here, but I would imagine he's going to say much the same thing I would say, which is that had the South become an independent nation, in order to begin establishing diplomatic relations with other nations in Europe, I think there would have been some kind of an expectation of a plan to eradicate itself from slavery. Now, I say that, and I think most people say that, but the fact is the United States had slavery. So that wasn't a condition for diplomatic relations with the United States government, so why should it have been with the South? So maybe I'm getting ahead of myself in saying that, but I think at some point the South needed to have some kind of a plan to start to slowly get itself out of a slave-dependent economy.
However, with the rise of abolition in Europe and the North, perhaps boycotting of Southern cotton could have encouraged them to disband their practice.
That's possible.
Britain could have gotten their cotton from India and Egypt anyway, so they could afford to take a moral stance. Just as South Africa was slowly forced from the international community to disband apartheid, so would
200
the
years
CSA
later.
be
Well,
forced
150
to give
years
up
later.
its slave-based economy. Combined with increasing industrialization, less economic profit, and need to compete with Western nations, opinion could be forced to change slavery in the South. Slavery would have been disbanded only in the face of complete economic collapse, but eventually it had to be abolished.
Yeah.
Or I sure hope it would have. With this, possible abolition enrages Southern whites, as they fear competition with blacks in the job market. We could see an alternate parallel of the KKK be born inside the South, but fighting against the anti-slavery Confederate government and free blacks. Even if the South disbanded slavery, that doesn't mean they allow equal rights to blacks.
No, I think that's a fair
black population
assumption.
In the CSA, almost 50% in some states.
Now, there weren't many states where that was the case, and we have to remember that the Confederacy, you can't put it all in one big block. Mississippi was very different than Tennessee or Virginia, for example. There's a reason why when Lincoln was first elected that it wasn't all of the states who seceded. It was the Deep South. It was the Cotton States, as they called them. It was Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida. States like Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Tennessee, they only seceded after the war broke out. Fort Sumter was fired upon, and Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. That was what pushed them over the line. They weren't willing to go all in on seceding just because of the issue of slavery, because slavery was actually much smaller in a lot of those states. In a place like Mississippi, the black population was literally half the population of that state, and slavery was a huge, huge part of the economy.
States, an undemocratic government would be put in place to keep black citizens from gaining political power. Much like an apartheid government in South Africa, however, with a sizable white population, the government maintained support. Uprisings, protests, and rebellions could become commonplace against the Southern government. Politics inside the Union are drastically shifted as Lincoln and the Republican Party are remembered as the people who lost the South.
Yeah.
Because Washington, D.C. is so close to the Confederates and it was built as a compromise between North and South, the capital of the U.S.
I could see
is
that.
moved, probably to a city such as New York or Philadelphia.
Now, I would think that's probably less likely compared to some of the other things he's talking about here, but yeah, I could see the possibility of that. But I don't know. I would say if I was putting together my own alternate history of what happened, I probably wouldn't say that Washington moves. But I certainly wouldn't put down the idea that that's possible. Now, I will agree with where I think he's going with this, which is, the post-Civil War period, that time from Lincoln's election in 1860 up until 1912, I guess it is, when Woodrow Wilson is elected. there's one Democrat elected president in that entire span of 50 years, and that was Grover Cleveland. Other than that, it was all Republicans and almost all Ohio Republicans who were elected president. So the South wins the Civil War. I think that goes very, very differently. But then again, a lot of the Democrats are in the South. So it'd be interesting to see. I would imagine a new party arises at that point, but I don't know. Let's see where he goes with this.
Yeah. Internationally, the United States and CSA would remain adversaries for the next few decades. Competition out west and in the Great Plains could even bring mini skirmishes between militias and citizens. The CSA had ambitions to expand after the war, and even during
Mexico,
sought
the
smaller
Caribbean
destabilization efforts in Mexico. Had the South won the Civil War and solved their internal struggles, they would have attempted to expand into Latin America.
Agree. I think most people agree on that.
Whether or not they could have accomplished this is up to you. Confederates did set up colonies in our timeline, though, including 20,000 Southerners who fled to Brazil. With the Industrial Revolution and rise of European colonies, the South would need to transform itself to compete with the rest of the Western world. It's hard to say if this could happen, since Southern life was based around agriculture. The South could have industrialized, but it must change most aspects of their lifestyle.
Now, there are other examples in history in the 19th century of nations beginning to industrialize who hadn't previously. I think of Russia. Who became the Soviet Union. They were a very rural, kind of agrarian society, even in the beginning part of the 1900s. So it could have been done, and I think the South probably would have recognized the need for that to happen.
If the Confederacy won, the United States would never have been the nation it is today. No surprise. The mindset of what makes us American would change as well. Before the war, people identified more with their state than nation.
Yep.
The
Ohio flag too.
changed
Nice.
all of
Go
that.
Buckeyes.
With a Union victory, America was united as one people.
It's said, and I know this has been referred to in movies like National Treasure, where they talk about, and this is absolutely true, the United States was always referred to plurally before the Civil War. The United States are. They always viewed the United States as a collection of states. It was only really viewed as a united nation. The United States is after the Civil War.
However, if the southern states broke away, this American unity is now difficult. Secession is a precedent which has proven to work. The effect of this would have larger consequences for the United States. This alternate U.S. is less of a country and more of a European Union.
He makes an interesting point, and that's not something I'd ever considered before. The fact that successful secession might possibly lead to more secession and more breakup after that. The idea that, okay, if I don't like it, I'm going to take my ball and go home. This was not the first time secession was talked about. New England talked about seceding in the very early stages of the American experiment. This is the first time it got to that point. So I hadn't thought of that. I think that's an excellent point. Not a lot of people bring that up.
Both American countries wouldn't have the influence they did united in our timeline. Having to compete with a new neighbor brings international conflicts closer to home. Odds are American influence, both Confederate and Union, never spread as far.
Fair.
Europe would remain the dominant force into the 21st century.
Can't argue with that.
There are many different scenarios for how the CSA would be had it won the Civil War. This is just one alternate timeline. There is no way to 100% predict how the world would be had events been changed, but it's fun to analyze the possibilities. What do you think the world would be like had the South won the Civil War? Say in the comments. Like us on Facebook and subscribe if you have not done.
All right, so interesting. Very interesting points. I'll just add kind of my own thoughts. I would agree with 90% of what he said there. I think he makes some excellent points about what that looks like. There's some fantastic alternate histories out there, especially the ones by Harry Turtledove, where he explores what the world looks like in a post-Southern victory in a Civil War. And what politics would have looked like. I could certainly see someone like James Longstreet having become president like he did in Turtledove's books. It'd be interesting to see what Lincoln would have done if he hadn't been assassinated. Turtledove kind of has him go down the route of socialism, which I don't know that I agree with that. but it's interesting to think about. So I would love to hear your comments about that. Use the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts about what you think a Southern victory would have looked like and what it would have meant for the world and what would have been required for that to take place. And if you got requests for other videos you'd like me to take a look at and do reactions to, or other topics you'd like me to address, just let me know in the comment section below. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.